It was supposed to be a quiet university party in my basement to keep the noise down and not disturb the condominium, but Patricia Whitmore, she freaked out. Not only did she call 911, she invented that I was holding people against their will. Suddenly my house was surrounded by police cars, officers staring at me like I was a criminal, and Patricia with her arms folded with that little smile of victory. Only she hadn't counted on the security camera unmasking everything. Ethan Reynolds, just wanted to have a party. That's all, a normal university party, the kind that everyone has done or been to once. No big deal. The plan was simple. Call up some friends, put up some nice lights, fill the fridge with cheap beer, and blast the music loud enough to get the crowd going, but without turning the neighborhood into an uncontrolled rave. And of course, use the basement to isolate the noise and not disturb anyone. But I'd forgotten one small detail. Fucking Patricia from the HOA. She was the kind of woman who could bother you even with the air you breathed. You know that neighbor who feels like she owns the street? The one who knows all the rules of the condominium, as if she wrote them herself? The one who has a personal hatred of anyone who seems to be enjoying themselves? That was her. You should be careful with Patricia. My next-door neighbor Marcus Chun had warned me when I first moved in. A retired attorney in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and a perpetual look of concerned wisdom. Marcus had lived in Oakwood Estates for over 20 years. She's had it out for anyone in your house since the development plans started. Development plans? I had asked, confused. Marcus nodded gravely. Her husband, Richard Whitmore, sits on the city council. There's been talk about expanding the community center, and your lot would provide the perfect access road. The last 3 owners all sold after mysterious code violations kept appearing. I had laughed it off at the time. Surely this was just neighborhood gossip. I tried to be discreet. I did everything according to the rules. I started the party early, warned people not to make a mess in the street, put a makeshift sign on the door asking people not to shout. But it seems that Patricia has an internal radar for moments of other people's happiness, because less than an hour into the party, there she was. First, she started off lightly. She appeared in my yard with her arms crossed like a general ready to give orders and stared. I swear I could feel her negative energy from there. She looked as if she had caught a crime in progress. This time I ignored it. I didn't even give a damn. I just got on with my life, talking, laughing, and drinking. But Patricia doesn't like being ignored. In the middle of the party, out of the blue, the doorbell rings. I thought, oh, there must be more people coming, but when I open the door, I find her standing there, holding a cell phone in her hand, and looking like she's already got a police report lined up. This music needs to go down now. She said with that tone that only people who think they're in charge of everything use. I roll my eyes, try not to lose my temper. I already knew that giving in wouldn't help because this kind of person doesn't just want you to turn the music down. They want to see you defeated. They want to know that they controlled you. But as I wanted to avoid a fight, I signaled the guys to turn the music down. Fina. She stared at me for a second, perhaps disappointed that I didn't react, and then turned on her heels and left. I thought, okay, problem solved. Oh, how naive I was. 5 minutes later, all hell broke loose. First came the sirens. I was in the basement when I heard the noise outside. A commotion. Muffled screams, heavy footsteps. I ran up the stairs, and when I reached the living room, I saw the red and blue lights flashing through the window. My heart leapt. Police? I opened the door and found 3 cars parked in front of me. 3. As if my house was a clandestine captivity or an international trafficking base. Behind them, Patricia, arms crossed. A satisfied smile on her lips, watching everything as if she had won an Oscar for Best Dramatic Performance. One of the policemen, a tall guy who looked like he couldn't take this kind of call anymore, looked at me and got straight to the point. We've received a report that people are being held against their will at this address. For a second, I thought I'd heard wrong. I looked around as if the universe itself could confirm that this was really happening. What? The policeman didn't repeat. He just stared at me, waiting for an answer. And that's when it hit me. Patricia hadn't simply complained about the noise. She hadn't asked for the music to be turned down. No. She had called 911 and told them that I was keeping people trapped in my basement. I felt a mixture of shock and anger surge through my body. It was so absurd that if it hadn't been for my own life at stake, I would have laughed. Look, officer, I'm having a party. There are people in the basement because it's the most isolated part of the house, but nobody is being held against their will. You can check it out. The officers exchanged glances. Some seemed to realize how crazy the situation was, but the complaint had been made. So now they had to investigate. They went in, passed through the people, went down to the basement. Everyone stood still, confused, some even laughing at the bizarre situation. To my surprise, Marcus Chun appeared at my side, seemingly out of nowhere. "I saw the police cars," he said quietly. "This is exactly how it started with the previous owners. False reports, escalating accusations. You think this is about the development plan?" I whispered. "I know it is," Marcus replied grimly. "Patricia's husband needs the zoning approval next month. You're the only obstacle." When the police returned, their faces said it all. "There's no one under arrest here." Patricia didn't like that at all. Suddenly, the victorious smile disappeared, and she moved on to the second phase of the plan, pretending she was just worried. But I heard screams. She raised her voice, trying to force an emotion that even she couldn't believe. Someone might be afraid to talk. One of the policemen turned to me. I gave him the same exhausted look. "Look, if you want to ask anyone here, feel free," I said, already fed up. They did. They asked two random people from the party, who obviously said they were there because they wanted to be. The policemen were clearly impatient. "Ma'am, the report was false. That's a crime." Patricia's face turned red. She mumbled something, looked at me as if I were the villain in the story, and in the end just turned and marched back home without saying another word. The policeman apologized for the confusion and left. I went back inside trying to get back into the party mood, but the truth was that episode had sucked all the fun out of the evening. And the worst thing of all, I knew it wouldn't stop there. You need to be proactive. Marcus advised after the party ended and we were cleaning up. If you wait for Patricia's next move, you'll always be defending. Start gathering evidence now. Evidence of what? I asked. Everything, he said firmly. Set up cameras, save emails, record conversations. Trust me, I've been watching her operate for years. She destroys people through 1,000 small cuts, none of which seem actionable on their own. The next day, I woke up with a headache that I didn't know whether it was from the hangover or the sheer anger that had built up. 911 at my door because of false report, and this woman still got away with it. I got out of bed, grabbed a coffee, and went to look out the window at the street, and there she was, as if nothing had happened. Patricia was in her backyard watering the plants in her bathrobe, as if she hadn't tried to throw me in jail the night before. The serenity of a criminal. I knew it wouldn't end there. That kind of person can't accept defeat. If she couldn't screw me over with the police, she was going to try something else. And I didn't have to wait long. That afternoon, while I was doing the dishes, the sound of wheels on the asphalt caught my attention. I looked out the window and saw a black car parked right on my sidewalk. Out of it came two guys in suits with briefcases in their hands. That was it. It now came the bureaucratic coup. When I opened the door, one of the suits, looking like a real estate agent from a TV commercial, smiled and handed me an envelope. "Good afternoon. We're here on behalf of the Residents Association to discuss a serious breach of the condominium rules." I took a deep breath. Throwing a party is a crime now, isn't it? The guy didn't even blink. "You've been reported for keeping an unused space in your home. In addition, there are allegations of danger to the safety of residents due to your activity." It almost made me laugh. I looked at the envelope, then at the two of them, and then at Patricia's house. She was on the veranda having tea, pretending she didn't even know what was going on. But I could tell she was savoring this moment as if it were a 5-star dinner. I picked up the papers and started reading. It was a formal notice from the HOA informing me that my basement was being considered an irregular space because it hadn't been registered on the house plan. That's a joke, right? The suit kept his face neutral. If there is no regularization within 30 days, a daily fine of $500 will be imposed, in addition to the possibility of legal action. There you go. I had entered the real circus of bureaucracy. Patricia hadn't managed to screw me over with the police, so now she was trying to suffocate me financially. And the worst part? The HOA could really make my life difficult. They didn't have the power to rule my house like a government, but they could create fines until I gave up fighting. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to stay calm. "Fine, can I appeal?" The suit gave a mechanical smile. "Of course you can. The next committee meeting is in 2 weeks. You can present your defense there." Good. 2 weeks to try and reason with a group of people who were probably already on her side. Perfect. As soon as they left, I took out my cell phone and started researching. I discovered that, yes, some residents associations really can impose fines for unregistered structures if they're within the rules. But at the same time, my basement was part of the original construction of the house. So how on earth could it be illegal? I decided to go to the town hall to get a copy of the original plan for my house. The woman at the counter, a lady who looked like she had dealt with desperate people before, took the papers, and looked at me with a certain weariness. Wah, sigh. HOA. I confirmed, sighing. She went to an old filing cabinet, rummaged around a bit, and came back with a bunch of yellowed papers. She handed me one and pointed to one of the pages. Here, the original plan of the house. And look at that, she smiled. The basement already existed when the house was built. I almost jumped for joy. I took the copies, thanked her, and went home with a plan. Marcus appeared at my door that evening, a thick folder under his arm. I thought you might need these, he said, handing me the folder. Inside were copies of every building code, HOA bylaw, and zoning regulation for our neighborhood. Why are you helping me? I asked, genuinely curious. Marcus's expression darkened. Because 20 years ago, my daughter died waiting for an ambulance that Patricia's husband diverted from our neighborhood during construction of their first development project. No one stood up to them then. I've been waiting for someone who would. I stared at him shocked. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, he said firmly. Be prepared, because they'll stop at nothing to get what they want. The next day, I went to the HOA office and handed in the paperwork. The woman at reception looked me up and down before taking the documents and telling me that I would hear back in up to 10 working days, because of course nothing is ever simple. And, as I expected, Patricia wasn't going to accept this turn of events easily. That night, while I was in the kitchen, I heard a strange noise coming from the front of the house. I went to the window and saw Patricia standing there with a flashlight in her hand, examining my house like a detective trying to find some hidden crime. I opened the door wide, and she jumped. May I ask what you're doing in my yard? She forced a smile. Just checking neighborhood security, you know. After what happened, I need to make sure everyone is safe. The audacity. You mean after your fake call to the police? Her face hardened. Well, some people prefer to act before something dangerous happens. I felt like screaming, but I just took a deep breath. Good. Then you can go home now, 'cause everything is safe here. She hesitated for a second, but then took a step back and returned to her territory, still looking like she had a card up her sleeve. I knew she wouldn't stop there, and I was right. The days passed, and the HOA remained absolutely silent. No emails, no calls, nothing. But I knew it wasn't because they had given up. It was because they were cooking up some new stunt. And Patricia was acting strangely civilized. She didn't stare at me with that hateful look. She didn't show up my yard making absurd excuses. And most frightening of all, she wasn't complaining about anything. It was a clear sign she was up to something, and I didn't have to wait long to find out what. One Saturday morning, I woke up to a strange noise. It wasn't a siren. It wasn't the police this time. Thank goodness. But there was something going on outside. I went to the window and saw a group of men standing right in front of my house. They were wearing City Hall uniforms and were examining my garden, pointing to the side of the house and discussing something. Oh, that's it. I put on a t-shirt, slippers, and went outside. Can I help you? One of the men looked at me with a tablet in his hand, as if he was about to give me a ticket for existence. We're here to carry out an inspection. There has been a report of structural irregularities in this residence. I closed my eyes for a second. Patricia's voice echoed in my head. If I can't win, I'll drown you in red tape. What kind of irregularity? I asked, running out of patience. The man shrugged. We need to do a full assessment before we can determine, but from what we have here, there are reports of unregulated electrical installations in the basement, a risk of infiltration, and possible damage to the structure of the house. It was an attack from all sides now. In addition to the HOA, the city council was also on my tail. Of course, I already knew where the complaint had come from. Should I have been surprised? Not at all. They came in, analyzed everything, checked wires that had been there since the world was a world, knocked on some walls as if they were looking for a hidden body, and left saying they were going to make a detailed report. Translation. If the HOA couldn't bend me over with fines, they were going to try to drown me in fees and official bureaucracy. Great. I muttered, locking the door after they left. I walked over to the living room window, and there she was, Patricia standing on the sidewalk, sipping a coffee as if she were casually enjoying the morning sun, but clearly waiting to see my reaction. I stare back. She smiled, the satisfied smile of someone who is sure she was in control of the situation. The most annoying part of it all, she didn't have to say anything. The message was clear. You're not going to win. That evening, Marcus invited me to his house. What I found there stunned me. His spare bedroom had been converted into what could only be described as a war room. 3 walls were covered with maps, photographs, and documents, all centered around Patricia and Richard Whitmore. The fourth wall was dominated by a large whiteboard with timelines and connection diagrams. What is all this? I asked, astonished. 20 years of evidence, Marcus replied, his voice steady. The Whitmores have been manipulating property values, falsifying violations, and driving people out of their homes to benefit their development companies. I've documented every case. Why haven't you gone to the authorities? Because until now, it's all been circumstantial. Nothing that would stand up in court. He looked at me intensely. But with your case, and with what's on your security cameras, we finally have direct evidence of fraud. My security cameras? I repeated, confused. Marcus smiled grimly. The ones I installed last week while you were at work. I hope you don't mind, but I had a feeling we'd need them. The HOA's reply arrived 3 days later. They informed me that as an act of good faith, they weren't going to impose the fine of $500 a day just yet, but that I needed a technical report proving that the basement didn't pose a structural risk. In other words, I now needed to pay an engineer to state the obvious. Of course, the goal wasn't safety. The goal was to get me to give up. They wanted to make me spend time, money, and patience until I simply gave up. Well, I wasn't going to. I went to an engineer, paid for the report, did everything right, and when I handed in the papers at the HOA, the woman at the front desk looked at me with a dry smile and said, "We'll need to review this at our next meeting." Oh yes, the damn meeting. 2 weeks later, there I was. The HOA meeting was being held at the home of one of the committee members who, ironically, seemed to need a lot more supervision than I did. The living room smelled musty, and I swear I saw a mouse running around near the kitchen, but of course it was my basement that was the real danger, right? Patricia was sitting at the head of the table like a queen on a throne, surrounded by her faithful subjects. When I arrived, she put on a little show, arranging the papers in front of her and giving me a look of superiority. To my surprise, Marcus was there too, sitting at the far end of the table. As a longtime resident and former HOA president, he still attended meetings, though he rarely spoke. I sat down, and the meeting began. Condo budget, new gardening rules, a resident had parked a trailer on the street, and this was unacceptable. Until it was my turn. Patricia snorted and gave me a condescending look. We have here the case of Mr. Reynolds, who recently had his home inspected because of several reports of irregularities. Several complaints, as if she wasn't the one making them all. After analysis, we found that although the basement is already part of the original structure of the house, there are concerns about its use. What concerns? I asked, crossing my arms. She looked at me as if I were a stubborn child. The recent history of parties and excessive noise raises questions about the impact this space could have on the neighborhood. In addition, there are reports of suspicious movement and activity that could compromise the well-being of the community. The level of absurdity made me laugh. Suspicious activity? You think I'm running a trafficking racket in my basement, do you? She didn't laugh. I'm not saying that, but considering the concerns of some residents, we want to implement a periodic inspection to ensure that the use of this space is up to HOA standards. In other words, they wanted to be able to enter my house whenever they wanted to check that I was behaving like an obedient resident. The nerve was unbelievable. I got up from my chair. So that's it. You can't fine me. You can't ban me from using the space. So now you want to inspect my house. Patricia smiled. These are preventative measures. I looked around. Most of the other committee members couldn't even look at me. I took a deep breath. Okay, so here's my proposal. Patricia raised her eyebrows in surprise. Proposal? I took out an envelope and slid it across the table. I've hired a lawyer. This is a notice that if anyone from the HOA steps foot in my yard without a warrant, I will sue you for trespassing. The silence was instantaneous. Patricia took the envelope with a forced smile. Do you really want to take it that way? I crossed my arms. I want to go down the road where you stop bothering me. She stared at me for a moment, then she smiled, and I knew that this fight wasn't over yet. Then Marcus cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him. Before we move on, he said calmly, I'd like to introduce some new information to the committee. Patricia's smile faltered. This isn't on the agenda, Marcus. I'm invoking Bylaw 7.3, which allows for the introduction of urgent business. Marcus replied, unruffled. He opened his briefcase and began distributing folders. These documents show a pattern of targeted harassment against homeowners whose properties are strategically located for the West Side Development Project. The room erupted in murmurs as committee members began flipping through the papers. This is outrageous. Patricia snapped. This has nothing to do with Mr. Reynolds' violations. On the contrary, Marcus continued, his voice steady. It shows that the violations against Mr. Reynolds are fabricated as part of a larger scheme to force him to sell his property at below market value. A property that, coincidentally, provides the only viable access road for your husband's new development. I left that meeting knowing one thing. Patricia wasn't going to give up. She could have taken a legal beating with my threat of a lawsuit, but people like her don't accept losing. It wasn't about the basement, it wasn't about the HOA, it wasn't even about the neighborhood. It was about the fact that, in her mind, I had challenged her little personal dictatorship, and of course, she was going to try to make amends. The question was how? The answer arrived 3 days later in the form of a ridiculously official piece of paper stuck to my door. Notification from the town hall. Temporary ban. It was a letter informing me that my house was being considered potentially unfit for habitation until a full structural inspection was carried out. Translation. Patricia had managed to get me out of my own house. I stared at that piece of paper for a moment, trying to absorb the woman's level of assholery. Then I did the only thing that made sense. I laughed. Yes, I laughed, because it had already left the territory of the absurd and gone straight into the comedy zone. Me, being temporarily evicted from my own home because someone felt the basement posed a risk. It was a daring strategy. With my house banned, I would have to go somewhere else. That meant she would have time and space to find some other way to screw me while I was away. But of course, I wasn't going to let that happen. Marcus showed up at my door 10 minutes after I found the notice. I was afraid of this, he said grimly. Richard Whitmore pulled strings at City Hall. The building commissioner who signed this is his golf buddy. So what do we do? I asked, feeling desperation creeping in for the first time. Marcus's expression was determined. We fight fire with fire. I've already called a former colleague at the State Housing Authority. This kind of localized evacuation order requires state-level approval, which they bypassed. Will that help? It buys us time, Marcus replied. And time is what we need for the final phase of our counterattack. My first stop was the town hall. The same woman who had helped me last time looked at me with an expression that said, "What now? HOA again. HOA again." She took the papers, looked at the complaint, and snorted. "This is ridiculous. They're claiming that your house is a risk based on nothing." That's right. She spun around in her chair and picked up a phone. "I'll call someone to sort it out now." Minutes later, a man in an ill-fitting suit appeared. He was an inspector from the prefecture. He picked up the interdiction paper and looked at it with an, "I can't believe I'm wasting time on this" face. "Right, we'll go to your house right away." We got there in less than 20 minutes. And guess who was on the sidewalk casually watering the plants, as if she wasn't expecting this inspection? That's right, Patricia. She pretended to be surprised to see me with the inspector. "Oh, what a coincidence. I was just talking to some neighbors about the importance of maintaining the structural safety of the houses around here." The inspector didn't even answer. He just walked in with me and started his inspection. He walked around the rooms, looked at the walls, checked the basement, and made some notes. When he went back upstairs, he looked tired. "I don't know who filed this complaint, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with your house. This was a waste of time. So can I stay?" He snorted. "I'm going to fill out the papers right now to overturn this ban. And if you want my advice, it might be worth filing a formal complaint against whoever made this false report." I looked at the window. Patricia was still there, trying to disguise the fact that she was paying attention to the conversation. I smiled. "Oh, you're damn right I will." 2 hours later, my house was officially free of the ban, and I had in my hands a copy of the inspector's report proving that the whole thing had been a low blow. And now it was my turn to act. I took out my cell phone and did exactly what the inspector suggested. I filed a formal complaint against Patricia with the town hall, but I didn't stop there. I made sure to attach all the documents proving the continuous harassment I had been suffering, the false call to the police, the invented fines, the attempted invasion of the HOA, and now the completely unfounded ban. I sent everything to the city's legal department, and, as icing on the cake, I got in touch with a lawyer who specializes in the abuse of power by housing associations. He listened patiently and said something that made my day. "It looks like we have quite a case of harassment and misuse of public resources here. Now things are going to get good." But Patricia had one more card to play, the most dangerous one yet. Late that night, I was awakened by the smell of smoke. I jumped out of bed to find the hallway filling with thick, acrid fumes. Fire. I grabbed my phone and ran for the door. But as I reached for the handle, I hesitated. Something wasn't right. The smoke was thick, but there was no heat. No crackling sounds of actual flames. I carefully opened the front door to find a smoke bomb on my porch, billowing gray clouds into my home. And across the street, barely visible in the darkness, was a figure watching. Patricia. Marcus materialized beside me, a fire extinguisher in hand. I've called 911, he said, quickly putting out the smoke bomb. And this time we've got her. The security cameras had captured everything. Patricia placing the smoke bomb, lighting it, and retreating to watch from across the street. When the police arrived, they didn't go to my house. They went directly to hers. The consequences were not long in coming. 2 weeks later, I received a formal email from the city informing me that Patricia was being investigated for false reporting and abuse of authority within the HOA. And a few days after that, even better news. The entire HOA was under audit. After all, if Patricia was using the system to screw with my life, who's to say she hadn't done the same to other people? The reactions in the neighborhood were interesting. Some neighbors, the ones who always looked uncomfortable but never spoke up, started chatting to me. I discovered that Patricia had already screwed over a lot of people over the years. Unfair fines, false accusations, veiled threats. She reigned supreme in the HOA because no one had the courage to stand up to her. Well, until now. Not everyone was pleased, though. Some longtime residents who had benefited from Patricia's regime, getting variances for their own property improvements while others were denied, viewed me as a troublemaker who was destabilizing the community. They argued that strict rules had maintained property values and that I was undermining years of careful neighborhood management. You don't understand what you're doing? One elderly neighbor told me at the grocery store. The Whitmores have kept this neighborhood safe and prosperous. Yes, Patricia can be difficult, but she gets results. Results for whom? I countered. The people she's driven out of their homes. The families who've been fined into bankruptcy. The neighborhood was divided, with battle lines clearly drawn. And then came the final blow. 2 weeks later, I received the best news of all. Patricia had been removed from the HOA. Yes, removed. After years of calling the shots. Controlling every inch of the neighborhood, as if it were her personal property, she had finally been ousted. The audit revealed that she was using her position for her own benefits, including diverting money from the budget to personal projects, read, her pool, and that wonderful deck that no one remembered approving. And the best part? Since I was one of the main whistleblowers, the HOA sent me a formal letter apologizing for the abuse I suffered. Oh, and they also canceled any fees or fines they had put in my name. Not bad for someone who a few weeks earlier had almost been kicked out of his own house. The state prosecutor's office announced they were opening a criminal investigation into both Patricia and Richard Whitmore for conspiracy, fraud, and misuse of public office. The West Side Development Project was suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. Marcus, who had been battling the Whitmores from the shadows for 2 decades, finally saw justice for his daughter. At a special community meeting, he was unanimously elected as the new HOA president. And Patricia? Well, she's disappeared. Literally. One day I woke up and saw a removal truck in front of her house. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She didn't make a fuss. She didn't attract attention. She just disappeared from a neighborhood like a soap opera villain whose ending is so humiliating that he doesn't even get a decent last scene. The neighborhood finally had peace. The basement continued to be my place for parties and meetings with friends without any crazy HOA trying to kick me out. And I learned a big lesson. If a Patricia tries to screw with you, be patient because in the end, they always screw themselves. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more videos.